Well, welcome to you all, to you intrepid souls, surviving members of the college class of 1957, and our guests as well. Without the usual teleprompter to rely upon here, I hope you won't be offended if I rely on my notes for these opening remarks. This way the staff won't have to fill in the gaps for what I've forgotten to say, or walk back from and reinterpret something that I misstated. We've seen that enough these days. This is our 13th, if you've been keeping track, quinquennial gathering of the past 65 years. And the Reunion Planning Group, which I'll introduce to you shortly, hopes this two-day session helps inform, entertain, and helps you all reconnect as well. To start with some current demographic information about the college class of 1957, which you may be aware of, but I'll repeat. There were some 1,180 of us who registered at Memorial Hall in that fall of 1953. As far as we can determine, there are about 580 of us left and remain. And there are about 165 of us, the names of which you'll see soon, in the memorial service this afternoon, remain or have died since our 60th reunion, 165 of us. And 52 of us are what Harvard terms as lost. That's Harvard speak for an alum who they don't know how to reach for fundraising purposes. The names of those who've departed we will see this afternoon, and I hope you all can attend the 4 o'clock memorial service. And as you can determine, this is a different Harvard College from the one we left 65 years ago. It's rated #1 university in the country by the Wall Street Journal these past 5 years in its annual survey. Harvard today is the 4th largest corporate enterprise in the state of Massachusetts. To support the global academic efforts of the university's 21,000 degree candidates, as well as keep in touch with the 400,000 alumni throughout the world, it employs 18,000 people, of which only 2,400 are actual instructional faculty. Kind of a interesting ratio there, and one I think which John Dowling would have some thoughts about, maybe not right immediately. The university's annual operating budget exceeds $5.3 billion, with a B, 40% of which is covered by a 4% annual draw from the corporation's $53 billion endowment. The administration manages and maintains 70 different libraries around the world, and 650 buildings. If I'm getting too much in the weeds here, don't worry, I'm going to stop right now. Occupying 25 million gross square feet of space, one of which is the Applied Science Center building, which you have a chance to see this afternoon as you take the bus tour, which cost a princely sum of $1.1 billion to put in the ground. So it's a different place. And if you're going to take the bus tour, how many are thinking of taking the bus tour? Could you show us hands here? So it's about 20 people, it looks like, yeah, roughly speaking. So much for the numbers. I'd like to take a minute or two to single out and thank some of our classmates who since September have labored in the trenches to arrange the activities that you're going to be part of today and tomorrow. Importantly, thanks to David Epstein. Is he here today? Not yet, maybe. All right. Who took on the task of organizing and producing the series of 8 class Zoom sessions offered throughout the year leading up to today. Those virtual presentation topics varied from defense of democracy, which David Scudder did as well, and to David Epstein's own classical Trojan War playlet, dramatizing whether negotiations and mediation might have avoided the confrontation in Greek classical literature that we know so much about, and obviously the Russian-Ukrainian war. Thanks to John Dowling as well, our remaining active faculty member, who helped us shape the Zoom calls throughout. And our thanks also to our other classmates who participated, too many to mention here, in the 8 sessions which we produced during the course of the year leading up to this. We had an average of 60 people attending those Zoom calls, one which we had 90 on the line as well. And thanks also to Gottfried Brieger, though he's not here today, had to bow out because of COVID, but for his beautiful ode, I think, to the class also of 2057, which you will have copies of if you haven't already got them. But think of Gottfried, who arrived at the age of 11 on a Hudson pier on a ship from Amsterdam, 1,000 other parentless children, 11 years old, not speaking a word of English, and then he turns around and takes the English language and forms it the way you have it in his ode. Quite an extraordinary accomplishment, I think, anyway. You should also know that our Los Angeles resident classmate, Al Williams, has taken a great deal of responsibility for organizing the events of today. In addition to proposing the topic for and arranging and moderating the seminar which follows shortly, this morning you'll hear Al's and Vic Brodny's trumpets as well throughout the day, and a call to action from Al will come regularly, and his participation as a member of our 4-man 65th Reunion Planning Group was really very, very much appreciated. He's organized the jazz concert tonight at Scullers, and he's brought in a piano player from New York and part of the Berkeley faculty, music, and he's doing it all on his own. It's a gift from Al to our class. Thank you, Al, for doing that. I'd also like to thank a member of our 4-man reunion committee, our class marshal, John Samorian, who's not here today again for COVID reasons, although he may be here tomorrow. John has got a reputation, at least amongst people who've gotten to know him recently, of being sort of our go-to negotiator when difficult matters in the class come up. He negotiates daily with the Teamsters Union in his ownership of a trucking company, so he's well qualified for that particular role. And I'd also be remiss if I did not thank our other member of the planning committee, classmate Newt Heislip here, for all he's done in the overall guidance and management and communications and interface and process with the HAA staff, as well as create much of the email material that you've received throughout the year. It may have my name on it, but you can be sure that Al is behind it, not Al, but Newt's behind it. He was a professor of infectious diseases at Tulane, and so he's going to brief us later on the COVID protocols here when he steps up next year. And he was also the chief editor of our 60th Reunion Class essay book, which I think everyone would agree was a real achievement. It only took him 2 years to do it, but thank you again, Newt, for doing that. And finally, at least my part of this, in the second booklet that you received, you were given either at the desk at the hotel or here this morning. You're going to find a preliminary draft of the preface and first chapter in which some of us have been involved in a project that has to do with Dr. John Finley. Interesting enough, there was never a full-fledged biography ever done of Dr. Finley. You would have expected someone would have done that very, very early after his death. But this is a project our recently deceased classmate Nellie Aldridge had to abandon because of ill health. And Konstantin Valhuli has taken it over. Konstantin is right there. He's joined us here come over from Stockholm, where he is presently, and he's very interested in anyone who might have had experiences with Dr. Finley they'd like to relate to him. He's throughout the reunion activities, you'll find him with us here at places like this or in other places. And even tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., we'll be sitting at the hotel breakfast room and ready to join with anyone who wants to come in, sit down with us, and maybe discuss what they remember about Dr. Finley. To this point, Constantine, and it's in draft form, has assembled roughly 650 double-spaced pages of text and illustrations, and he's preparing to present that to an editor shortly for publication sometime in the fall, we think, we're hoping for. That's still, yeah. So enough for this. Newt's going to step up here shortly, but let me thank also, I don't know if she's here, Abby Hilton, who's been our contact at the HAA. She's done this under unusually difficult circumstances. The HAA has not been in their office for the last 2 years, so it's all been done virtually and remotely. And also to Diane McDonald, who rushed to get our book out here. And even though it's late, and the reason was the paper stock was not available to print. That's one thing that COVID we probably haven't learned about or realized. Paper mills all shut down when COVID intervened. And it took a long time to get them up and running again, and the same kind of print paper that we've used in the book since then is now available, and she just got them here for us very short. Right. Anyway, Jack Cashman worked with Diane as well on this. Anyway, enough for mine. Newt, step in, and thank you for all the work you've done.
Good morning. Can you all hear me?
Morning.
No? You need to have it turned up a bit louder. Could we have it turned up a little bit? Okay. First of all, as always, thanks to Jim for putting us all in this room, and also for those of you who are out there in video land, welcome. This morning's program is very interesting, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. The COVID recommendations are when we are indoors, if we're not in separate areas, which is the big room here, you can spread out. It is, unless you're a speaker, please wear your masks. But if you're with other people that don't need masks, that's okay. At dinner, it's also recommended that we have our masks on between bites. But we're in Cambridge. But that's important because we're all in the risk group by age, if nothing else. So this morning we have this very special program, and unfortunately 2 of the people who were supposed to be on the program are not here, but we have 3 outstanding people who will be talking to you. I would like to just make a few remarks first about one of the people who is here, who is not here, I should say, and then Al will speak about Dr. Reed. Originally, Dr. Kenneth I. Shine, our classmate, was going to be on this program, and unfortunately, he is not able to be here. And Ken was going to be on the program because of his tremendous impact on medicine. And we have 2 giants from our class who had a huge impact on medicine, Ken being one, and Al Davis being another. Ken wrote in his essay for the essay book a piece called Healthcare, Past, Present, and Future. And I'm going to read you a couple of excerpts from it because it sets the scene and also tells you something about what Ken's thoughts are and also how they became reality. He starts out with polio. He says, in the late summer of 1955, during one of the last poliomyelitis epidemics in Boston, when the power failed, I was a volunteer on a ward at the Massachusetts General Hospital, which cared for 12 to 15 pregnant women in drinker tank respirators. The respirators were used for individuals whose central respiratory system had been damaged by poliovirus. The pregnant women and their families were committed not only to the survival of the mother, but especially that of the baby. Suddenly, one afternoon, and Ken was a student at Harvard College at this time, volunteering during the polio epidemic, at 3 p.m., the power failed. The drinker respirators depended upon electricity to function. Emergency generators immediately began operating, but they served only outlets in the corridors. The nurses began to wheel the respirators into the corridor as quickly as possible to reestablish power, and the emergency search for extension cords was undertaken. My responsibility was to hand crank each respirator 3 or 4 times in order to ventilate the patient until power could be restored to their machine. I raced around from drinker to drinker, terrified that one of the patients might die from lack of ventilation. Fortunately, power was reestablished without serious complications. It was my fledgling introduction to emergency care. That same year, 1955, Jonas Salk introduced his new vaccine. Polio was eradicated from the United States in 1979, and in the Western Hemisphere shortly thereafter. Efforts to eliminate the last vestiges of polio in the rest of the world continue today. The enormous, expensive, and inefficient tank respirators were rapidly replaced by positive pressure respirators. I have had the opportunity on a number of occasions to speak to medical audiences about advances in healthcare. When asked if anyone has seen a case of acute poliomyelitis, no more than 1 or 2 older physicians raised their hands. So Ken went on to become a medical resident, intern and resident at the Mass General. He developed a very early interest in health care from the cardiac perspective and went on to become a cardiologist. His first experiences were looking at death from heart attack. In those days, those of us who are old enough to remember the Eisenhower heart attack. Otherwise, people stayed in bed for over a month after a heart attack. Those people who were Eisenhower because he had a job to do were only in bed for 2 weeks. Today, it's a completely different story. Ken went on to research the treatment of heart attacks when he became chief resident in medicine at the Mass General in 1968. And then he did a cardiac fellowship. And he was looking at these questions of outcome in terms of the outcome of bed rest for such long periods of time. It had its own complications, so forth. He then became interested in oncology as he moved up the ranks, and he became chief of medicine at UCLA. But early on, he had an experience where he was dealing with a patient at the time on Hodgkin's disease. There was no treatment for it. And young people died from it because it was a disease very commonly of young people. And he describes being an intern at the MGH with a 25-year-old patient who was being treated for end-stage Hodgkin's disease, which was ablative, basically, chemotherapy. It was before the days of staging, before the days of splenectomy, and so forth. And his patient turned to him as he was injecting medicine into her IV line with a question, and she said, "Am I going to die?" And he said, "I was rather shaken. She was younger than I, and the intimacy of the relationship in the darkened room caused me to pause with a rush of adrenaline. I thought of all the usual platitudes about our desire to do everything we could to help her. Instead, I responded, 'Why do you ask?' Without hesitation, she indicated she was a school teacher with a class of 12 deaf children in Connecticut. She said the students were doing quite well, and if she were going to die, she would like to write to each of them a letter encouraging them to continue their studies. 'Do you think it's time to write those letters?' she asked. I said, 'Yes, it would be a good thing to do.' And over the next 2.5 weeks, she read to me sections of these letters as I was giving her medication. And then she died. I learned an enormous amount from this patient, first and foremost, not to insert my own anxieties or thoughts about pivotal questions, but rather to try to really understand what the patient wanted to know. Second, to realize that the objective of the patient was often to discover information that was, in fact, not a direct response to questions. Throughout my career, when patients have asked me whether they were going to die, I've always responded, "Why do you ask?" By the time AIDS came, Ken was in UCLA and at the beginning of the epidemic, and there was a lot of concern about, like today, as we've just been through with COVID, what are the facts? Changing information. What about the virus? What about resistance? What kinds of prophylactic steps should be taken? And he then went on to become very interested in assessing healthcare delivery. So instead of looking at the biology of heart disease, which is what he was doing early on, that issue of practical application became his thesis as he went forward. He said he'd always been interested in the way healthcare was delivered, and his interest peaked early when, as a medical student, a Harvard medical student by the name of Michael Crichton approached me and some other residents to let him know when certain patients were admitted. It was his intention to follow these patients through their care. We accommodated Crichton, who then wrote a book called 5 Patients, documenting their experience. The book is very reasonable and readable and provides insight as to what could be done at that time for care of the 5 conditions which he described. A particular note was his analysis of healthcare costs. A day at the Massachusetts General at that time cost approximately $80. Crichton suggested that it would go as high as $100 a day and provided an explanation as to why the cost was so high. He also speculated that costs might rise to as much as 6% of gross domestic product in the United States. Michael Crichton went on to write a very distinguished literary career, starting with The Andromeda Strain and a whole series of other science fiction books. He clearly had an uncanny ability to understand the possibilities and implications of science and technology for good and evil. However, his estimates on healthcare quality completely missed the rate of change, which has brought us close to 18% of gross domestic product and an average cost of hospitalization that approaches $17,000. So Ken then went on to become the head of the Institute of Medicine. And his first major effort there was looking at the quality of care and quality of care research at the Institute of Medicine. And his first effort was reducing medical errors, which of course was also oriented towards identifying medical errors. He started with a roundtable and then a committee which produced 2 early publications. The first one, To Err is Human, which was published in 1999 and identified the extraordinarily high number of errors made in the American healthcare system and the need to substantially improve patient safety. It was followed by a report called Crossing the Quality Chasm, which was a more profound, in-depth assessment of the quality across the system. I won't go through the details of all of that, and Al will be addressing some of those points. So ultimately, Ken's career then went from the Institute of Medicine to building medical schools. Why not? He was asked by the Texas system to go and help design medical care education in medical schools, but ultimately ended up helping to design the Michael Dell School of Medicine. He also was a consummate politician. He knew how to deal with all of the various people that he came across with and leave them feeling positive, and therefore he was able to get a great deal done. So I will just summarize his statement by reading this brief part about his biography. Kenneth Schein, MD, after graduation from Harvard Medical School, trained at the Massachusetts General Hospital, the University of California in Los Angeles, and then joined the faculty in 1971, ultimately becoming Dean of the School of Medicine and Provost for Health Sciences at UCLA. In 1992, Dr. Shine was named president of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences, now the National Academy of Medicine, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization chartered to advise the federal government on health science and health care. He addressed the quality of care in America with the landmark reports To Err Is Human in 1999 and Crossing the Quality Chasm, a new health system for the 21st century in 2001. After 11 years in Washington in 2003, Dr. Shine became Executive Vice Chancellor for Health Affairs in the University of Texas System with responsibility for 6 health campuses. He spearheaded a project called Code Red, the critical condition of health in Texas, and had laid the groundwork for 2 new medical schools in Austin and South Texas. He also served as professor of medicine in one of those schools, at Dell Medical School in Austin. He has been married to Carolyn Lois Shine, a retired high school mathematics teacher for 63 years. They have 2 children, Daniel and Rebecca. Thank you, Ken. All the best to you and Carolyn. Then let's turn to a brief introduction of our other giant from the class of 1957 in medicine, and that's Dr. Richard Allen Williams. He also has a wonderful chapter in the essay book called My Lifetime of Pride and Prejudice Before, During, and After Harvard. And I recommend that you read it. It is online as well as hopefully in your library. He talks about going to Harvard. He talks about adapting to a system where he was recruited as an excellent athlete, an excellent musician, and an excellent mind, all of which he succeeded in doing. I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts here. And the first one is Life After Harvard. He said, I graduated from Harvard with honors in 1957 and went on to medical school at the State University of New York downstate, internship at the University of California, San Francisco, internal medicine at the University of Southern California, and cardiology fellowship at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, where I subsequently joined the faculty under the late George Widmer Thorne, who was also my chief. He encouraged me to follow my interest in health problems of blacks by writing my first of 9 books, the 900-page textbook of black-related diseases, which was published by McGraw-Hill Book Company in 1975. It was only the second medical textbook ever published by an African American. Dr. William A. Hinton, a professor of Harvard Medical School, was the first. He goes on to describe some of the other activities that he had, including activities that are not related to medicine as a clinician, but another organization that he founded was the Association of Black Cardiologists, which he started in 1975 to address inequities in cardiovascular care between blacks and whites. One of the things that stimulated me, he wrote, was to form this organization was the fact that blacks were being misunderstood by whites in medicine, and there were demeaning publications in peer-reviewed medical journals stating that black patients did not experience chest pain, as whites did, because blacks lacked the intellectual capacity to perceive pain. In his book, The Philadelphia Negro, the eminent alumnus W.E. Du Bois was the first to study a black community in the United States, and his later essay, The Talented Tenth, in the book The Negro Problems, 1903, focused on a mythical subset of blacks whom he felt should be selected for classic training as an elite cadre of blacks to be leaders in our society. He writes, I may have been an unknowing member of this group. I can point to my career and the numerous accomplishments that have accrued to my credit with the feeling that I have disproved Professor Pitram's Farooq's pronouncements about the intellectual deficiencies of blacks. I often say I now have more yesterdays than tomorrows, and that it is important for me not to rest on my laurels, but to continue to push for more positive change in the limited time that I have left. And finally, he says, future generations will look back on this time to determine if being black in America has continued to be a condition that incites prejudice, as it did for me and my patients, who, in the final analysis, may be said to have been better than I was because they survived so many more abuses than I did and emerged from their experiences with the utmost dignity. They are my heroes, and whatever I am is completely attributed to their example. I am also confident that although there is still ill will in the world, as Dr. King stated, the arc of the university is long, and it eventually curves towards justice. Keeping this in mind, I firmly believe that we shall overcome. So, to summarize then from Dr. Williams' biography, Richard Allen Williams, MD, Fellow of the American College of Cardiology, Fellow of the American College of Physicians, current President of the National Medical Association, is Clinical Professor of Medicine at UCLA School of Medicine, and President and CEO of Minority Health Institute in Los Angeles. A graduate of the State University of New York Downstate Medical Center, he trained in internal medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and Los Angeles County USC Medical Center, and in cardiology at Harvard Medical School and Boston's Brigham and Women's Hospital. While at Harvard Medical School, he successfully initiated the first recruitment of minority medical trainees to Boston hospitals. Following specialty training, he became assistant medical director at the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Hospital in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. Recruited to West Los Angeles VA Hospital as chief of the Heart Station and Coronary Care Unit, he rose to chief of cardiology. A founder in 1974 and former president of the Association of Black Cardiologists, he's also a founding board member and former chair of the Institute for the Advancement of Multicultural and Minority Medicine. Author of textbook of Black-related diseases, his latest book is Blacks in Medicine, Clinical, Demographic, and Socioeconomic Correlations. He has received numerous awards, which are described in the brochure, as well as in biographies of the distinguished guests that we have this morning, I should say. Al, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My fellow classmates, and maybe a few other people who have come in. This is an historic occasion, and I'm sure that you feel it just as I do. I first want to comment on some things that Newt just brought up. First, the wonderful accolades that you gave me. I hope that I'm deserving of them, but I also wanted to comment on the accolades that you gave to Ken Shine, which are well-deserved. Ken and I have had many interactions over the course of our careers since we both graduated from Harvard in 1957, and I've always admired his career and looked at him as a leader in regards to my own ambitions. Particularly noteworthy was what Newt mentioned regarding Ken's leadership at the Institute of Medicine and the important publications that came out of that, particularly the Crossing the Quality Chasm publication, which had to do with focusing on quality improvement in healthcare. That was a quantum leap in regards to making advances in the field of healthcare. And no one should be surprised that Ken Shine was the person who led that particular attempt. Following what Ken did at the IOM, there was a publication of another report in 2003, which I think was the year that Ken left the IOM. And that was what we called the Institute of Medicine report. I don't want to go on and on about that, but that was really the beginning of our intensive interest in what we now call healthcare disparities, and really got us off the dime from the standpoint of calling out the problems in medicine that have to do with institutional racism. And so 20 years later or so, we're dealing with that now. And we come to this point where we're going to be discussing some aspects of not only institutional racism, but also what we call health equity. The title of our symposium today, I think, belies all of that, in that we're calling attention to what I call a crisis in healthcare delivery. And that has to do with the fact that we really don't have equity in healthcare delivery, which is responsible for not only a great deal of morbidity, but mortality, loss of life, and loss of money, income, productivity, and so forth. And so today we're going to address some of those issues with our panel and try to bring to your attention the tremendous problem that we're trying to deal with in this country. Before we get into that, I want to call attention to the fact that a lot of what we're saying today emanates from our interest in what this country has gone through over the past few centuries regarding slavery and its aftermath. And you all are aware of the fact that our wonderful president, Larry Bacow, recently released what is called the Legacy of Slavery report. If you haven't read that, you need to read it, because it calls out a lot of things that not only Harvard was involved in, but the entire nation was, and the importance of slavery and its impact on healthcare delivery as we're experiencing it now. So even though I won't be talking particularly about that report today, that report serves as a background for everything that we're talking about today regarding health equity, because all of these concerns really emanate from that horrible evil of slavery a little over 400 years ago. I'm going to be the first speaker on our panel, and I'm going to try to do that expeditiously if I can. My talk is hopefully going to be somewhat brief and intense, but it's going to be focused in three particular areas. The first area will be what I call my personal journey, just to give you a few ideas of what I've gone through in trying to achieve, so to speak, in healthcare, in medicine, and serving as, I guess you might say, an example for others who've followed, because I've achieved a number of what you might call firsts for a black person in medicine, and I'm proud to have done that, but that pride doesn't serve me very well if I don't look at it as something that would engender some help that those coming after me have been given through my example. So I'll begin simply by saying that a lot of what I'm going to allude to is represented in our red book, which Jim Joslin has been the wonderful person who has produced that for our class. And I'm sure that all of you are aware of it. If you're not, you need to look at it, read it. There are excerpts from several of our lives and careers that are meaningful. And mine in particular has a lot of information which I can't talk about today, but I'll simply allude to. When I was your classmate back in 1953, I arrived on campus not knowing anything about this wonderful institution and what I was going to be confronted with. I was admitted to Harvard at the age of 16 and started matriculating at 17. And fresh out of Wilmington, Delaware. There was a culture shock to me because of the fact that all of my education, K through 12, had been in black institutions, elementary school, high school, et cetera, middle school, high school, and so forth. And so it was a shock to me to have two white roommates in Matthews Hall. It was a shock to them as well, cultural shock, because they hadn't encountered that before. But we got along fine together, and we learned a lot from each other. I'm going to kind of jump to some other things that happened during my time at Harvard, which had to do with the fact that I think a lot of people didn't know how to deal with me. I was not necessarily a rarity as a black person on the Harvard campus, but somewhat unusual. And from the standpoint of social activities, I really didn't have much involvement. I didn't get invitations to go to the beer blast and so forth. But that was fine. You know, I wanted to use the time to study anyway. And we got along fine. Met several friends who made it easy for me to socialize on the campus. And I met several folks who were instrumental to my career and my thinking. Ken Shine, in fact, was one of them. He and his roommate, Eddie, were inspirations to me because I could sit down and talk to them about a number of things other than just the academic stuff. And is Emil Chi here today? Emil was supposed to be coming in from the West Coast. He was a buddy that I hung out with a great deal on campus. And so we were able to get through a number of the confrontations that I dealt with as a black person on the Harvard campus. Fast forward to medical school and to internship and residency, suffice it to say that life was not easy in any of those stops, at any of those points. Mike Klein, my associate at Brigham and Women's, we called it Peter at Brigham at that time, knows of some of the things that we all encountered in that setting, and it led to my being inspired to look at healthcare problems of minorities because there didn't seem to be any particular concern or regard for that at that time. And so it led to my getting a great deal of help from Dr. George Thorne, our leader at Brigham. And it led to my producing this book, which is called The Textbook of Black-Related Diseases, which Dr. Thorne got published for me through McGraw-Hill, which is his publisher for Harrison's Textbook of Medicine. I was very gratified for that, because without his help, this book could not have happened. The importance of the book was that it focused on health problems of blacks as the principal minority at that time in the United States, and brought to the attention of many people some of the problems that folks, including me, did not know existed. we now know that there's a particular need to emphasize health problems of African Americans and other minorities. And so that I feel was one of the things that came out of all of those deliberations. And really fast forward to the present time, I've recently completed my 9th book on subjects that have to do with healthcare for minorities and healthcare reform and all of those sorts of things. With this book, which is called Blacks in Medicine, Newt alluded to it earlier, which I was very happy to produce, and it's a 5,000-year compendium of the black experience in medicine going back to the times of Imhotep. I want to now turn to my formal presentation for the next 10 minutes or so, if we can start my slide deck. Yes. So I call this Historical, Clinical, and Sociocultural Perspectives. How do I change it? Okay. In medicine, a focus on achieving health equity for blacks, African Americans, and other underrepresented minorities, or URM. I'm going to bypass all of that stuff because Newt has laid it out pretty well. And I want to show you this slide. My friend Emil Shi is not here, I guess, but he would be proud of the fact that I studied Mandarin for a period of time, fascinated by the Chinese language. And one of the things that I called from that language was this particular expression. It's called Weiji, which in Mandarin means crisis, which is a combination of danger and opportunity. John F. Kennedy used it in a speech in 1959, and it's a good little symbol because of the fact that at least at the present time, we can say that it symbolizes what's happening with us right now in regards to dealing with the pandemic. Pandemic is certainly a crisis situation, but it also, even though it embodies danger, it offers us an opportunity to deal with some other issues by unmasking, for instance, all of the healthcare disparities and disproportionalities in regards to the impact of health problems in certain areas of the population. So that's the reason that I put that in there. I've talked about my personal journey, and I'm just going to give you a brief tidbit on the ancient history of blacks in medicine, starting really with Imhotep, who 5,000 years ago lived in Egypt and was recognized as the first doctor in the history of medicine. He was also deified. A lot of us would hope that that might happen to us. I don't think, Mike, what do you think? In any event, he has been an inspiration for a lot of us, but particularly those of us who are African Americans who are blacks in medicine. To know that a black person was the first person recognized as a doctor in the history of the world. Fast forward to the intermediate history, and I've already alluded to the ravages of slavery, and that being the origins of healthcare disparities. This particular slide, which you may not be able to see very well, depicts Dr. J. Marion Sims, who is called the father of American gynecology, examining a slave girl during slavery, during the times of slavery, and doing public gynecological examinations and experimentation on her. Absolutely horrible. There was no respect at all for black women or men, and this epitomized that. I think that these are kinds of things that people need to know about, because Dr. J. Marion Sims, who went on to become, for instance, the president of the AMA, was accepted by white medicine as a champion and a hero because of the experiments that he did and the results that led to some advances in gynecology, but at the expense of these people who were subjugated to his work. I can't give you intimate details about these other gentlemen that you're going to see now, but these are all doctors, early doctors, black doctors in our history. The one on the my far right, in the military outfit, is Dr. Delaney, who was actually the first black student at Harvard Medical School in 1850. He didn't finish Harvard Medical School because of the fact that he was thrown out at the behest of the students who didn't want to study with him. And long story there, which you can read about in my book, but that, I think, served as an example of the discriminatory practices in education that were going on. So even though blacks had a hard time treating themselves or getting treatment, they decided that they needed to establish some institutions of their own. And the first two that were established were Howard University College of Medicine in Washington, D.C. in 1868, and Meharry Medical College, I think about 1872. Along the way, up through 1910, about 11 black institutions of medicine, medical schools, were established. But at that time, there was a report which came out after some investigation that led to the disestablishment or the elimination of all of the black medical schools in this country except for Howard and Meharry. That led to diminution of the numbers of blacks who were able to be trained in medicine. And that deficit still exists to this day, to the point that less than 4% of the doctors in the United States are African American. These are some of the earliest black doctors and slave doctors in America. The ones on the left are the ones who were the MD, including Dr. Lucas Santabay, who was recognized as the first black doctor to practice in the United States, and many others, including Dr. Martin Robinson Delaney, who I told you was the first black doctor, the first black student at Harvard Medical School. Never got his MD from Harvard because he was ejected, but did finish through preceptorship after that. And the ones on the right are what we called slave doctors, who were very outstanding. I wish I had more time to tell you about them, but I'll just mention one of them. He's the gentleman at the top of the list named Onesimus. And he actually was a slave here in Boston. Yes, Boston did have slaves. And in the 1700s, there was a smallpox epidemic in Boston, which Onesimus actually helped to eradicate because of the fact that he developed through his boss, who was Cotton Mather, a Harvard professor, a vaccine for the smallpox, which was tremendously effective. And it was really the first vaccine developed in the United States. No matter what you think about Jenner and all of the things that you read about in the regular medical history books, this man was the first, Newt, you probably know about this, to develop a meaningful, useful vaccine. And he was a slave. Long story about that. The people of Boston who were benefited by this didn't take kindly to it. And in fact, they stormed Cotton Mather's house and tried to burn it down because they heard that this slave, this heathen, had developed this cure, so to speak, or preventive for smallpox. Well, a lot more could be said about that, but move on to what I call the era of black medical autonomy. I'm showing here the picture of an organization that I've been privileged to head. It's just called the National Medical Association, which consists of about 40,000 African American physicians. It's the largest black organization, medical organization in the world. And this was at the National Convention in Boston in 1909. This organization was formed in 1895 in Atlanta, Georgia, as a response to the discrimination that black doctors faced from the AMA, which would not admit blacks. AMA was organized in 1847, and it wasn't until really relatively recently that blacks were allowed admission into the AMA. So in the meantime, it was necessary for black doctors to create their own thing, and they did. So that organization is now over 125 years old and is serving a great purpose from the standpoint of leading black medicine. I'm going to move on to my conclusion very quickly. This is a picture of Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, a distant relative of mine, who in 1893 did what I recognize as the first operation on the human heart in history in Chicago, Illinois, at his hospital, Provident Hospital, where he sewed up the pericardium of a patient who had been stabbed in the heart and saved his life. And so, of course, we know about a lot of other individuals who've done fantastic work in open heart surgery, pioneers there. But this gentleman should be credited with doing the first operation on the living human heart, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams. Many people don't know about that, and they need to. And here's finally a professor from Harvard Medical School who is also unrecognized, relatively, William Augustus Hinton, who was a professor at Harvard and wrote the first book on syphilology at Harvard, first book in the United States, which is now in the Smithsonian Institution. And my two books are as well, I'm proud to say. I've joined him there. So, much more in regards to black medical heroes. This is Dr. W. Montague Cobb, who was the person who led the fight not only for things like civil rights, but also voting rights, held the Imhotep sessions with all of the presidents, including President Johnson, Kennedy, and so forth, back in the 50s and 60s, 40s as well, at the White House, which led to the positive actions in not only those issues, but also in opening up hospitals, which Vikas is going to be talking about, which were strictly segregated at the time. And Dr. Charles Richard Drew, who is credited with developing blood transfusion and the development of blood plasma for use during World War II. I'll finish with just mentioning what I consider 17 critical events in Black medical history which have impacted us regarding healthcare delivery. I mentioned already the creation of the American Medical Association in 1847. There was the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision in 1857, which was really very monumental because what that did when Judge Roger Taney made his declaration that blacks were not the same as whites, physically, etc., and could only be recognized as being 3/5 of white men, and therefore not able to receive civil rights, not, as he put it, as black men not able to be respected as full men. That led to repercussions down through the years, the decades, which we feel resonating right now. There's the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of the American Civil War, the adoption of the 14th Amendment giving Negroes full citizenship in 1868. And by the way, let me just mention that it wasn't too many years ago when if you wanted to make a designation of a black person, you may have had some difficulty. People didn't know what to call us. There were some demeaning expressions that were used early on, and then those evolved. But eventually terms such as Negroes were used, and then eventually Afro-Americans, and now African Americans. Back in the days when we were at Harvard, you may be surprised to know that the news programs, when they announced news about blacks in their reports, they always prefaced the black person's name with Negro. So, for instance, I would be called Negro Al Williams. And in fact, I was at a couple of times when I was subjected to news reports. Well, to move on, there was a creation, as I mentioned, of the National Medical Association in 1895, the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision on separate but equal, which was a blockbuster, and I've alluded to the Flexner Report in 1910, which was that report that removed all of the black schools, medical schools, except for Howard and Meharry, from existence. Some people thought that was good because the whole purpose was to clean up medicine, so to speak. But I think it went overboard in terms of eliminating a resource for developing, an educational resource for developing black doctors we're still suffering from. Obviously, it was the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the year after we started college. I could go on and on about that, but some of our classmates were very instrumental in the aftermath of all of that. The Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Civil Rights Act in 1964, affirmative action in 1968, creation of the National Institutes of Health. My goodness, that was monumental in 1972. I've got on here the founding of the Association of Black Cardiologists, which I was responsible for in 1974. The Malone-Heckler Report, which actually identified discrimination and institutionalized racism in medicine. And finally, the Institute of Medicine Report, which you've alluded to, and the passage of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, or the ACA, in 2010 by Barack Obama. Well, there's much more that I wish I could present to you, but time does not permit that. I'll simply mention that Dr. Martin Luther King was very concerned about healthcare disparities himself, and said that of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and inhumane. And there he is in his Nobel Peace Prize awards. My final piece has to do with something that we're dealing with now, and that's the COVID pandemic. And this is an excerpt from Harvard Magazine, which shows this something that you may not be able to see very clearly, but it was very graphic in showing the skin as being the body's largest organ, which deflects danger, heralds disease, and captures sensory stimuli. And in this pandemic, its color might mean the difference between life and death. And I think that that's something that we've been dealing with undercurrently. This, I think, brings it to focus. In 2020, more Black Americans will die of COVID-19 than will succumb to diabetes, strokes, accidents, or pneumonia. In fact, COVID is the third leading cause of death for African Americans. It really has had quite an impact, and shows the disproportionality that blacks were 3.5 times and the Latinx community members twice as likely to die from COVID than whites. So therein lies some things that we need to be concerned about. Health equity, which is what I started with, started talking about, you should understand, is a state in which health outcomes and healthcare costs are not determined by race, ethnicity, gender, geographic location, or socioeconomic status. And it's not the same as health equality, which means giving everyone the same opportunities of care, et cetera. Subtle differences, but important ones. And although I can't elaborate on this now, this goes back to something that was developed during Ken Shine's time at the IOM, the definition of what was needed for healthcare improvement. And you can see that health equity is number one on the list. There were other things that were done. That today we've developed what we call the quintuple aim of improving population health, enhancing the care experience, reducing costs, eliminating physician burnout, and of course advancing health equity. So you can see how important health equity is in the mix. And finally, I want to point out to those of you who are involved in industry that there is a business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or what we call DEI. Here are some meaningful figures that $93 billion in excess care costs are mounted up each year. These are figures from Ernst & Young, who many of you understand and respect. And the cost to industry is $42 billion a year in lost productivity. So dollar signs count. And those of you who understand business realize that there is a particular value in achieving health equity that will percolate in your industry. Okay, well, in conclusion, I've said a little something in our Harvard Latin, res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. And I'm sure that all of you understand what that means from the standpoint of the importance of achieving health equity, which will be of benefit for all of us. Thank you very much for allowing me to present this. Now I have the privilege to present our next speaker, who is Dr. Robert Higgins. Dr. Higgins' biography is in your program book, so I will not attempt to read all of it, but you should know that he is the president of Brigham and Women's Hospital here in Boston. He has a long and fine history in medicine and healthcare. He's a card-carrying cardiothoracic surgeon who has such wonderful credentials. I can't go through all of them, but he's here to talk to you about some specific aspects of these issues that we're discussing today that have to do with health equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. Bob, would you come to the podium, please?
Thank you. Let's see if we can. Yeah, great. Thank you. Appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to join you today. It really is a pleasure and an honor, and I am. Never in my wildest imagination would have I expected to be in these circumstances at this time. Just a little bit more about my background. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon. I'm a clinical doctor who has been in practice since 1992. And I carved a career having grown up in New England. Again, my mom and dad met in Nashville at Meharry when my dad was a medical student in the 50s. And then he served in the Navy, and I was born in San Diego in 1958. And they came back to Charleston, South Carolina, where my dad was born, and then he was one of the first underrepresented minority physicians in service to the community. And then unfortunately, in 1964, he was killed in a car accident when I was 5, and my brothers were 3 and 1. And my mom, without any life insurance, was left alone. So we moved back to New York, and we moved in with my grandparents, and they raised us for the next 15 years in a 2-bedroom apartment in upstate New York. I was afforded extraordinary opportunities in that regard. And so I think one of the themes of my comments today, and I'll be brief, is about opportunities. It's one of those things that happened. We were pretty mischievous, 3 young African-American boys in the middle of a tough circumstance. And my mom threatened that if we didn't behave, she would send us to military school. And damn if she didn't do it. So she sent us to this place called the Albany Academy, which was ROTC, and we learned about discipline, but mostly it fully deployed us. You had to play a sport, you had to march in the military, you had to go to class, and you had to get discipline. And so we were fortunate, while she worked a couple jobs, to benefit from that education, and it's the foundation upon which my academic career has been built. And then I was recruited as an athlete to play in the woods of Hanover at Dartmouth. It was a fantastic experience. Spent a lot of time down here in Cambridge, having fun. And it was a great opportunity. And then I ended up in New Haven in medical school. And so my career was catapulted by lots of people committing to my career and instilling in us the message that it had to be about excellence. And so with that foundation, I'll share some thoughts about what I believe is important in this dialogue about how we serve our communities, serve the population that we care for. Many of you have been patients in the medical system, some of you at Harvard, some of you at the Brigham and Mass General, great institutions. So I'm honored to be here with you today to share some reflections about that. So I'm going to take a page from Dr. Williams' book and really try to think a little bit about this crisis in U.S. healthcare and taking a closer look at health equity and education. And I'm hopeful that we will be able to find a silver lining in the otherwise dark clouds that prevail around the communities that we live and work in. And again, I'm honored to be, as the president of the Brigham, the first of hopefully a successful tenure in that regard. So one of my favorite movies is The Perfect Storm, and many of you may be familiar with this, but a perfect storm is a particularly bad or critical state of affairs arising from a number of negative and unpredictable factors. And there was a movie about commercial fishermen out of the Boston area you're probably familiar with. George Clooney was in that movie. And of course, my mom and my wife's favorite actor. And so it's about they were commercial fishermen. They went out and they had a confluence of significant problems that occurred. And it was based upon the book written about this challenging set of circumstances. Ultimately, they lost their lives. Well, we're in a bit of a perfect storm right now. As you think about 2020 till now, the COVID pandemic has shocked us. We didn't even know anything about it 3 years ago. It's created significant economic challenges, but it's also unmasked and uncovered significant socio-political issues which we were not expecting, I don't think. They were behind the scenes, but it's made this a very difficult time, a turbulent time, and a moment in time which we will have to rethink about. It has a significant economic impact, and of course, the political and racial unrest that has occurred in parallel with that makes it really tough. So I'm hopeful we can find a silver lining, and this is my message to my faculty and to our staff. The Brigham now is made up of 22,000 employees, of which I'm the president, and we have responsibility for the academic mission, teaching, research, and education. And it's a daunting task, and thank goodness that I stand on the shoulders of so many qualified and capable people to help run that enterprise. The Brigham is then also, as you probably recently heard, part of the Mass General Brigham health system, where Mass General and the Brigham used to intensely compete. We are now partners, small p, not big P partners, small p partners. And we are building a bridge between the two academic enterprises. So I report to Ann Klebansky, who is the CEO of Mass General Brigham, and the other president, David Brown, and I are great friends, and we are partners between the three of us, and we're building a bridge. The expectation for those of you who are in business and finance, 1 + 1 could actually equal 3 if we make this marriage work. And that's the premise upon which we are building this new enterprise. That leads to 79,000 employees at 16 hospitals, with the 2 academic medical centers being the pillar of support. The other 14 hospitals are the Rehab Hospital, Faulkner, Eye and Ear, any number of other. So it's a daunting task to manage a $16 billion enterprise, of which the Brigham contributes $5.4 billion. So it's a extraordinary task, but I love a challenge. And I'm proud to be part of it and honored to be serving. I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit about some of the things that have happened in our environment, which I'm passionate about. And as Dr. Williams pointed out, and I'm sure Rivas is going to talk a little bit about, it is the idea that we can create a better world and that we can create a more diverse and inclusive environment while doing God's work, taking care of patients, training the next generation of physicians and nurses, and ultimately serving the communities in which we reside. But it's a daunting task, and so I'm a fan of history as well. And this famous historian has really helped me understand. It's like deja vu all over again. And you know what deja vu is, right? The feeling that one has lived through the present situation before. And I think that is the circumstances as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and improving the health equity in our communities. As a person of color in the United States, it has been a challenge. But these are not new phenomenon. As you heard, over 400 years of forced servitude. But in 1918, there was a similar pandemic. And that was really a hallmark moment. It's pretty clear that the experiences of being black in America is now a point of consternation for all of you, as it is with all of us, primarily because of social media, which shows us things that we didn't necessarily understand about the world. And it really demonstrates that there are human rights violations that are occurring every day. And they happened in 1918 when there were race riots, and then in the 1960s before the Civil Rights Amendment, and now in the 2000s when we worry about George Floyd and all the other things that are happening. It really is a remarkable time. in history. And as recently as January, here at the Brigham, I'm on the job for a month. And one of our faculty reported a paper about how people who came to the emergency room with heart failure, they studied to make sure that we were giving the right care to for the right patients. And unfortunately, they unmasked a problem, that if you were a white person and you had heart failure, you were admitted to the heart failure service with all the expertise and science that was available. But if you were a person of color, you might not get the same level of care. And they reported that in the literature and said, we can fix this and make it equal for everybody, trying to do the right thing. Well, apparently that was misinterpreted by some white supremacists who showed up outside the hospital and said that the Brigham is